Roots, New Art on Stage.
Welcome everybody to the 12th edition of Gesellschaftsspiele, the Art of Assembly. Today we will talk about pitfalls of representation, assemblies in theater, and I'm very happy to be joined by Isabelle Fremeaux and Jay Jordan from the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination, by Kasia Wojcik from the School of Resistance, and by theater director Milo Rau, whom all I will introduce more properly a bit later on. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm a curator, a writer, and dramaturg, and hosting this series, which is initiated together with Brut Vienna. This edition is quite a special one because the Art of Assembly is today part of the School of Resistance and vice versa. The School of Resistance is part of the Art of Assembly. So I'm very excited and thankful for this collaboration and want to thank everybody that made this possible behind the School of Resistance, and also the team of Ent that is hosting this evening. This podcast is based on a Zoom conversation held on January 29th, 2022. And the Art of Resistance is a series of lectures and conversations investigating and speculating on the potential of gatherings in activism, politics, and art. We started pretty much a year ago, and by now have covered quite a wide field of topics with an array of amazing contributors. So you might want to check out the other podcasts and also our website www.art-of-assembly.net, where you find videos of all the past lectures as well as a lot of additional material. The topic of tonight's episode is really at the very center of the reason for this series, which went in many other directions so far, but stems really from an interest in assemblies in theater and assemblies in activism and their relationship and their contradictions. So numerous theater makers and artists have been inspired by the concept and the performative reality of assemblies in recent years, creating, directing, initiating trials, parliaments, congresses, summits, and assemblies in white cubes and black boxes, on proscenium stages and in public spaces. But the relationship between the theatrical and political representation remains complicated. What are the differences and what is the proximity between physical presence within an art institution and on, for example, an occupied square? So I remember quite some dismissing comment at a project called Artist Organizations International, which Jonas Stahl, Joanna Warscha, and me initiated in Berlin in 2014. So somebody more from the activist side said, you have to turn everything into the theater. And this was not a compliment. It basically meant you turn political issues into art, and by this you render them worthless. So like a negative Midas effect. Everything art touches in politics or activism makes it worthless. I understand where this comment comes from, but of course I would have a different take on this. Because there is indeed a crucial difference. The activist of an anarchist assembly is considered a space of authentic negotiation, a space for trying to abolish established hierarchies, for not only trying out but living a different way of decision making. While theater's assembly might sympathize strongly with these ideas, I would argue that at the end it has an essentially different take. Theater is not only a social but always also a self-reflexive practice, despite the fact that conventional approaches have been neglected. Theater is a paradoxical machine that marks a sphere where things are real and not real at the same time. So theater proposes situations and practices that are symbolic and actual at once. So it does not enable an artificial outside of pure criticality, nor is it able to lure its audience into mere immersive identification. The social fears, the assemblies theater can create, offer the possibilities of part-taking and at the same time watching oneself from the outside. So Brecht's alienation effect in this regard is not an invention, it's rather a discovery of something that constitutes all theater. Just of course that not all theater admit that. admits that or even tries to make a consistent use of it. So while our guests tonight have, of course, a lot in common and engage at the same side in different struggles, we also want to look at the differences and perhaps contradictions in their approaches. We start with Milo Rau, who has initiated such an abundance of projects that it does not really make sense to pin him down to only one strand of them. I understand that. But still, today I want to focus on the trials, tribunals, assemblies that he has been staging. These works have been an inspiration for this series because they are a work of art, and at the same time, they want to intervene very directly into the political reality they are surrounded by. This is their quality, and it's perhaps also their problem. This is something we will discuss today. Then we move on to Kasia Wojcik, who is one of the persons behind the School of Resistance, and that maybe already marks a difference between the School of Resistance and the trials I was talking about, where there's clearly one director behind it. School of Resistance is a collaborative effort, and the School of Resistance uses theatrical settings, but understands itself as activists, not as an artistic project. So Kasia, who is a dramaturg, poet, and artivist, will talk about their work, but also why she believes art and art institutions can be useful for activist struggles. And last not least, I welcome the activist Isabelle Fremeaux and Jay Jordan from the Laboratory of Insurrectionary Imagination. And already the name tells the whole story by drawing together imagination and insurrection in one phrase. So they live in the Z, the zone to defend in France, and they will tell us more about that also in their contribution. And they very clearly and often and beautifully have stated their belief: if you truly want to do politics, you have to desert the institutions of art and entangle insurrectionary imagination into the everyday life of movements. So welcome again, everybody, and we begin with Milo. Milo Rau is not only a theater maker, but also a filmmaker, sociologist, writer, and journalist. Before he made his entree into theater, he spent years reporting from conflict areas such as northern Iraq and Syria. In 2007, he founded the International Institute for Political Murder, which, in addition to theatrical productions, film, videos, and performances, also publishes books and organizes debates on social and political themes. Since September 2018, Milo is also the new artistic director, or not so new anymore, the artistic director of Entangle. Welcome, Milo, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florian. It's a big pleasure to be with you here. I mean, what you said in the beginning in your introductory speech is for me quite interesting on how I think we look on assemblies, and perhaps I can expand a little bit on that. That on the one hand, especially we German-speaking guys, we are very pro-alienation effect, and on the other hand, we want to overcome the alienation effect. So we are always, when we are talking about assemblies and what this gathering theater, where you look on something that you are enacting in the same time, what you exactly are in that moment is very questionable, and this is taken in this dialectics, I would say, of escape alienation and kind of searching for alienation to step out of the immersion of the I don't know, of however we can name it as a wrongly understood life and wrongly did practice. So before I was a war correspondent and the writer, and before I then started to do theater, I started as an organizer of big manifestations in Switzerland for the young socialists. And the other big question always was, how would you bring, for example, on the 1st of May, or when we were protesting against the neoliberalization of the universities or other topics, how would you bring together different parties, different groups, from anarchists to classical trade unionists, to one event? And how would this event happen, and how would this event go through a city, and how does it end with speeches and everything? I think, Kasia, you know these problems very well also now when we are doing the first live school of resistances. So how is this all organized? Just a political assembly. And later I started doing theater, and of course I was experimenting this format in black boxes. You were mentioning the trials and the tribunals, this started in, I think, in 2013 that I did the first trial. So it was called the Moscow trials. I can come to this because it was the first time I did it, a bit by an accident. And I will try to understand, going through some of these projects in the next 10, 12 minutes, how can an assembly, an aesthetic assembly, because it's still theater, that's true, that's perhaps the difference of what we will hear later in this meeting. How can it represent reality? How can it reflect reality? How can it change reality? And how can this change of reality be sustainable, or can go on when the so-called art project is finished? I think one of the big questions of social engaged theater makers. So the Moscow trials happened a bit by accident, I would say, because I was invited to do a reenactment of a Stalinistic trial of the 30s. I went to Moscow, and there I was immersed in the whole scene of activist artists. At that time, it was a bit before everything was freezed. So, for example, I met Pussy Riot. It was before they played in the Holy Savior Cathedral, and it was a group, and they were just playing here and there, like many other artists too in Moscow. And but I understood that when I do a trial, it shouldn't be a reenactment of an old trial, because I was giving a conference like this one about the trial against Bukharin in 1937. And then somebody said, but it's exactly the same situation like today, but today it's against artists. There were two exhibitions that were made in the Sakharov Center that were destroyed by right-wing vandals, right-wing extremists. And then the strange thing was that not these extremists were put in front of a tribunal, but the makers of these, you could say, more leftist, modernist, postmodernist, as they say in Russia, exhibitions. So I decided to remake these two tribunals against these artists. And when I was in the middle of doing that, this big scandal around Pussy Riot happened. And I remember that somebody was telling me, Milo, this is the third one. So you should take this one too. So Katja, she was not sent to prison, one of the Pussy Riots. I invited her too, and I invited all these artists. And this is what you could call an antagonistic model, and their enemies. So let's say that the right-wing people, the orthodox people, to restage this tribunal, but in real life, following Russian law, inside the Sakharov Center, where these exhibitions happened that were destroyed. And for me, that was point one, how to bring together these people, how to represent this society that only reacts on each other. And I constituted a popular jury, and the tribunal happened during 3 days with a lot of, you can see that in a film, with a lot of little interruptions. So it was attacked by the Cossacks, it was attacked by the Secret Service, and the outcome was in dubio pro reo. So it was like 3-3 with one exception. So they were liberated. And of course, this was the first time that I was asking myself. I remember in the moment when the jury was retired, and I was sitting there with Pussy Riot and the other artists and activists, and asking myself, but what would it mean if the outcome would be the same? Like in reality, what would have been possible? We did more tribunals in that style. One in Zurich, for example, in my hometown, against the fascist newspaper. They won, so that's the problem. The fascist newspaper won the tribunal, and the third one, and this became a new format, was the Congo tribunal. So it's and it's the first time that I created something that is not only an antagonistic representation of reality or trying to bring whole society together in one room. It was creating what we call a symbolic institution. So an institution that should exist but doesn't exist at that moment and will stop to exist when a real institution will start to exist. So we gathered advocates from Congo and from international law advocates together to put on trial the international mining companies. So Swiss companies, companies from Canada that are exploiting at that very moment the eastern and the south region of the Congo, where you can find the biggest resources of coltan, of cobalt, of gold. So what they call strategic minerals, because they are very important for example, the IT industry. And we started in Eastern Congo to do this tribunal, and we went on. This tribunal became quite fast independent from us. So last time in December, I was in Kolwezi, so the world capital of cobalt, to make a tribunal against Glencore, the biggest mining company. And at that moment, I was only as part of the jury. So the Congo tribunal, you could say, went completely into the hands of the house of Congolese advocates and some international advocates. So it became an independent institution, but still symbolic in the way that an international economic tribunal doesn't exist, because there is no law that would be the basis of it. Also, this law we had to create. The interesting thing, besides the fact that we could attack enterprises, the UN, the Congolese government and other players there is no tribunal where you could attack them, was that something super complex like world economy could be brought together in one room. So that's something that always interests me, to have, for example, a manager of a mining company, somebody from a group armé, from an armed group, from a guerrilla, somebody from just a worker in the mining industry, somebody who was pushed from his earth, a little peasant, and so on, all together in one room, to following the law, representing world economy in different cases. So that was the Congo Tribunal. It's ongoing. We tried to, last time we connected it to some initiatives in different countries in Europe to make these transnational companies accountable in their home countries. So we lost the initiative in Switzerland, but it's ongoing, and we hope that in the next time that there is a vote, we can push it a bit more, and it will happen, because it was quite near. And but still, the sustainability of these kind of projects is quite unstable. So I want to come to the last project that for me was super important, or perhaps two. I have, I think, 3 minutes more, to the Revolt of Dignity, which was based on a Jesus movie we did in Matera in South Italy. What would happen if Jesus would come today to the south of Italy, and the situation there. So this capital of culture where we did it, according a bit to the film that the Italian maker Pasolini did 50 years away, is very absurd. So you have this European capital of culture, and around you have the reality of South Europe. So you have 100,000, some even say 1 million of illegalized migrant workers on the tomato fields that are exploited by the big companies, by the mafia, etc. So we tried to connect the making of this film and the creation of a kind of an overall solidarity between the workers coming from Africa, the Italian little farmers, the trade unionists, and all kind of groups, to create an overall movement, which we depicted in the film as the movement of Jesus. And the interesting thing is that the outcome of this film were 3 things. So first thing we said, who plays in this movie has 10 documents and becomes regularized, becomes citizen of Europe. So that's what happened. And then we said we want to have what we call a microecology, so a whole distribution system that now what we did, we used the film as you could say, a propaganda tool to sell these tomatoes produced by the Jesus of the film, Yvon Sagnier, and his colleagues, his apostles, to sell it in 150 independent little shops in all over Europe. So what happens is that by this film, these people started to produce tomatoes. By producing tomatoes, they get papers. By getting papers, they can sell the tomatoes. By the money that comes back, they can own land and they can produce more tomatoes. And it became a kind of a circle, an alternative economy, you could say, that until that moment liberated almost 1,000 or regularized almost 1,000 migrant workers that could step out of in the film depicted system of mafia exploitation on the big fields in south of Italy. The second example, and I think I have one minute left, because it's a bit a new branch we are in, is what happened in Orestes in Mosul. So I made it as a kind of classical theater play, as a co-production of the Entegent and the Fine Arts Academy of Mosul. So with actors from Mosul, the former capital of the Islamic State, and actors from Belgium. And we produced it in Mosul, but it was completely impossible to tour it. So the actors of Mosul would only be on video. And I said to myself, but that's a bit nonsense after all this collaboration to just go on tour with a play. And together with the UNESCO, we could produce or found in this time as an outcome of this project, the film school in Mosul. And the idea of the film school again is to use, you could say, the capitalist distribution system of culture to construct cultural infrastructure where you wouldn't expect it, to liberate people. So what they will do, they produce now the 9 first films in the film school of Mosul that we will, through a film festival, try to bring in the international circuit, and by this refinance the school and produce more films in Mosul. So to produce a parallel system of representation and production of art. And I think that's a bit the way I wanted to describe, from representing a situation like Russia 2013, changing a situation like it happened in the Congo tribunal, where ministers were dismissed thanks to some of the witnesses of the tribunal. Some of the cases we represented to micro ecologies, or some also call it micro economies of a sustainable way of producing art in another way.
So thank you very much, Milo. A lot to talk about later on. We will do so after the other contributions. And I first now would like to welcome also Kasia Wojcik from the School of Resistance. The School of Resistance I will not introduce much because you will do so in length in a moment. I just maybe mention that it is a global network founded by IIPM, the International Institute of Political Murder, and the theater Entegent, and functions as a hybrid live stream debate series. As a symbolic institution of the future, the initiative examines aesthetic practices of resistance. And I guess that's to quite a degree something we have in common between the School of Resistance and the Art of Assembly. Kasia Wojcik is, together with Eline Banken and Martin Valdes-Dauber and Georg Blokus, senior creator of the School of Resistance. She's a dramaturg, poet, and activist. She's also part of Staub zu Glitzer, the initiative organized around in critique of the Volksbühne Berlin that we talked about in the Art of Assembly in the 10th edition, if I remember right. you're also since 2017 part of the IIPM, and you were co-dramaturg of the General Assembly in 2017 that we will talk later about. Milo didn't mention it yet, and co-campaigner of the New Gospel in 2020. Thank you so much for joining us, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Florian. Okay, everybody can hear me, I hope. It was the birthday of a great teacher this week, Angela Davis, and I would like to start this grounded, embodied lecture, as I call it, with a quote by the Marxist, philosopher, and political activist she is. "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." Theater as a magical tool. I do believe one can say that new forms of political interventionist theater that create reality and change reality by connecting reality are emerging, and I find it quite beautiful. The Chilean Colectivo Las Tesis, that was also guest in our School of Resistance, with their performance El Violador Eres Tú, spread like a wildfire over the whole globe, sparking the imagination of a global collective inspired by the radical revolutions happening on the streets in Chile in autumn 2019. We could connect all of this, if we want to the history of interventionist art over the last 100 years. The Russian avant-garde with people like Nikolai Evreinov during the Russian Revolution, but also action art created in the 1960s. And I think our School of Resistance is just situated in this very complex but interwoven net of activists, but also artistic practices and methodologies. School of Resistance started in May 2020 as a joint project, as was said, by IIPM and the NT-Gent, right after the outbreak of the pandemic, with the online speech of the indigenous artist and activist Kay Sara, the green of the Brazilian forest behind her, and she sent out an urgent message to everybody listening that this planet is on fire. Some days ago, the close friend of a very dearly loved person was murdered in Colombia. Albeiro Camayo, another indigenous leader on the Latin American continent, defending his community and Mother Earth, that he and his community are so dearly connected to in the last centuries. I would say we live in accelerated times and we live in compromised times. What started as an online debate series has in the meantime grown into a multidisciplinary, envisioning day event in which artists, activists, philosophers, and engaged citizens search and envision a more sustainable future for our common planet. A symbolic institution, as Milo just described, which is global, decolonial, clearly feminist, and intersectional. The questions we are asking: how to live in this world as a multifaceted, polyphonic humanity, and what kind of knowledge do we need to gather and assemble, and yes, assemble for a solidary future? How to understand the deep connections between the climate crisis and the human right to migrate and to use the freedom of movement? How to conquer authoritarian ideology while also creating new radically democratic spaces? What can we do? But let me first introduce myself to you before I explain to you in detail the experiments we created and encountered in the last 1.5 years. I'm speaking to you today about assembling political power and using the magical tool of theater and art. Because, first of all, I come from a migrant working class background of the Polish political diaspora in Germany. And theater was never the space where my family and our community went. I think because in Germany it's still very closed for a certain class. And I got to know the power of theater through our public school system. So as part of the, I call it Hogwarts generation, theater, art, and poetry became my own personal tool for survival. in a time where the world started to enter in new times of crisis. Planes flying into skyscrapers when I was 11, deep racism killing people in terrorist attacks in my own country, like in Halle, and also in Hanau, and a renewal of authoritarian and fascist ideology entering the global political stage. Second, in the beginning of my 20s, I became a dedicated political activist in various progressive movements and initiatives. Although as part of the Generation Y, I missed the whole Occupy movement because I was still too much engaged in the neoliberal dream that I grew up in. And I participated in my first political rally for the right to the city for all and migrant rights in 2013 in Hamburg. Afterwards, St. Pauli, the district of Hamburg where I was born, was declared a danger zone by the local administration, declaring left progressives as enemies of the state to fight against. In 2017, 4 years later, I experienced my first collective trauma with my allies in the G20 summit in the exact same city I was born in. I suffered through stages of severe cynicism, of being tired, of political engagement, of deep anger and rage, but also persistence, long camaraderie, networks of solidarity, and growth. In the last years, my friends and comrades were radically asking, how can theaters become active spaces of civil society again? Who can enter these spaces? Who do city theaters and national theaters belong to? And I think School of Resistance sees itself as one of the many experimental toolboxes that are currently being created to radically open up the theater to communities of solidarity, of care, and of knowledge. So after getting to know me now a little bit, I would like to introduce you to School of Resistance, the last one in Cologne, where we tried to assemble political power by using theatrical as well as performative tools. Under the slogan for politics of justice, we entered or were invited by the Schauspiel Cologne on the weekend of the German national elections last September. As connecting already to what Milo said, through our campaign with migrant and illegal workers in the project New Gospel, we as the IIPM created our own distribution channels, directly supporting illegalized workers in southern Italy, closely cooperating with activists and trade unionists, and a month of really heavy connecting, daily Zoom meetings with progressive German NGOs and also in Europe, helped us to connect to campaigns in the German scene, linking even members of the European Parliament to our cause and having a close creative session with Leave No One Behind, an NGO in Germany that was created after the burning of Moria on the Greek island of Lesbos. So how could we join forces to intervene in the highly energetic summer of the German elections? I remember it was a time of frenzy and energy also in our team, but we asked these questions. How can the system of dehumanization, illegalization, and exploitation of migrants in Europe be overturned? And in a big collaboration with different actors like Seebrücke, Sea-Watch, Pro Asyl, we connected to the campaign Human Rights Are Non-Negotiable. And we released a commonly written manifesto, the so-called Cologne Declaration for a Policy of Justice and Humanity, signed by over 80 public figures right before election day. And we created a joint fundraising campaign which supports human rights lawyers to bring responsible politicians and officials to court. I think I could say that we really did explore in a big alliance of the civil society new possibilities and potentials for the convergence of art and activism. Locally, we connected the School of Political Hope to the School of Resistance, a lot of schools emerging, that organized a city entangled workshop program. We organized 3 hybrid panels with experts of change from the Congo to Pakistan to Lesbos to Kassel. And because we are a school, our program of people's education in its I think, truest sense, we ask the how questions again. How can we build social movements and create tools for civil disobedience? But now, what's next? Because my favorite political slogan is, after the rally is before the rally. So after all our last events in Munich, Berlin, and Cologne, the School of Resistance is landing now in the Belgian city of Ghent. On March 4th and March 5th, you're dearly invited, all listening. We will coordinate together with Ghent Sondergrenzen, the In My Name campaign, and La Coordination de Sans Papier, which hunger strikes last summer in Brussels, the undocumented refugees in Ghent who will voice their political will. How can we make Ghent a city of solidarity and even a sanctuary city, as local initiatives are trying to build it up? And who are the citizens of Ghent today? Who is the citizen to enter the anti-Ghent? And we will experiment with different workshops on art and activism, connecting also to local climate activists to actively decolonize our knowledge, as well as give the stage to undocumented artists. We believe that self-organization and representation of the disenfranchised and illegalized is our political goal of the coming years. And the European elections of 2024 are maybe another symbolic moment we can maybe wrap our minds around together. Political exclusion and disenfranchisement of workers need to be overcome. This means also the idea of voting rights for migrants, regularization of illegalized citizens, and the radical opening of political institutions. As a theatrical project, we can reimagine democracy and try to bring it back to its core of community, solidarity, and care. Centralizing the question of the political subject in a global society, as we already tried in the General Assembly 2017, is crucial. And we as the School of Resistance think that at some point, the campaigning logic of the civil society will fix what the state doesn't want to fix has to transition into a very clear political conquest of institutions, as Milo wrote once in a mail. And because, let's be honest, we tried everything: occupations, conferences, campaigns. It is not enough. And we need to deconstruct and reconstruct ideas of political representation, but also create the political conquest of institutions. And I'm coming to my end now. Bear with me. March through the institutions was coined in the '68 movement. But how about hacking institutions, playing in its true theatrical sense with institutions? How can we enter public spaces like theaters or cultural institutions and shift and shape the hegemony of public discourse, but also create new communities of care? We have the space. Look at the castle that is right now being rebuilt in the middle of effing Berlin. It is huge. So much space. So what can art do and what can't it do? We can generate creative methods for political movements. And I think Jay and Isa are more active on the ground specialists for that than me. But we are thinking right now in our networks about legal creative strategies and how to intersect art, justice, and activism. If you have anything on your mind, please write us. And I do believe, and I think my colleagues believe the same, that art gives us the utopian space to think the impossible and improbable, and the poetic creation of the world and our relation towards it. And we are all relational beings. We relate to the materiality of this planet. There are no rules and no boundaries. Like artisans, we can shape imagination, thought, and even feelings. And this could be our possibility to overcome the dogma of there is no alternative of the late 90s, which I'm a child of. Artistic knowledge can be a true tool for the radical transformation of the world we want to live in. And I think for me, it's a world of solidarity, care and community, justice and friendship. So my last lesson I would like to share with you now, after 5 years of engaged political art and activism: keep up the micro work. every conversation, every new relation counts. You don't always need a huge audience or a scandal. Be patient with the small steps, the persevering relations, the patience of common creation. It takes time, although we don't have the time. So believe in your own micro work. And now ending again with the quote by one of our teachers I started at the beginning of this lecture. Angela Davis, again, you have the floor. You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world. And you have to do it all the fucking time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasia. I'm really also looking forward to discuss more how hackable art institutions actually are and what your experiences with this struggle actually are. But before that, I would like to introduce our last two contributors, Isabelle Fremeaux and Jay Jordan. Isabelle is an educator, facilitator, and author. She was a lecturer in media and cultural studies at Birkbeck College University in London from 2001 to 2011, before deserting the academy to apply herself to movement building. She co-authored / directed the film/book Les Sentiers de l'Utopie in 2010, and most recently, We Are Nature Defending Itself, Entangling Art, Activism, and Autonomous Zones, together with Jay Jordan, which just came out, and I can just only recommend to everybody to get this great and very insightful book. Jay Jordan is an art activist, author, part-time sex worker, and full-time troublemaker, labeled a domestic extremist by the UK police and a magician of rebellion by the French press. Jay has spent 3 decades applying what he learned from theater and performance art to direct action. They founded the direct action groups Reclaim the Street and the Clown Army, worked as a cinematographer for Naomi Klein's The Take, co-edited the book We Are Everywhere, The Irresistible Rise of Global Anti-Capitalism in 2004, and lectures in theater and fine art. And both Isabelle and Jay inhabit the liberated territory of the ZAD in Notre-Dame-des-Landes, a rebel territory that fought off a climate-wrecking airport project. We will hear much more about it in a moment. Isabelle's and Jay's contribution is a video. So in this podcast, you will not get the images. You can find them on our website, but through the text, you anyway will get a comprehensive idea of what they are talking about. Thanks, Isabelle and Jay, and film up.
We begin with compost. That swarming multitude of microorganisms, that seething, teeming soup of aliveness, which transforms everything in its grips. Death into life, life into death, and back again and again. Compost. It's a chemistry of carcasses that transforms all who inhabit it. Flesh ingesting and digesting flesh, life rotting and shitting, but always bringing forth prairies and forests, food and flowers. It's a chemistry to which we will all eventually return. Compost comes from the Latin com, with, together, post, from ponere, meaning to place ourselves together. This is one of the reasons we begin to talk about the art of assembly with compost, but it's not the only one.
In many ways, assemblies are the beating heart of the laboratory of insurrectionary imagination's practice. We see them as prefigurative rehearsals and trainings for a revolutionary process, for creating worlds without competition and domination in the here and now. Since 2004, we have brought artists together with activists to co-design and deploy creative forms of disobedience. We don't call our practice works or pieces or projects, but experiments, and every experiment is self-organized through consensus decision-making, where everyone is part of the process of collective design. Consensus, to literally sense together, to feel something together. Consensus is the opposite of voting, where the majority get their way and the minority have to just accept to lose. Consensus is a process of listening to everyone and synthesizing each other's feelings and ideas into a solution that all can actively support, or at least can live with. Consensus is never easy because no one spectates. For it to genuinely work, everyone must contribute and believe that collective intelligence is in reach. At times, we have brought this process into the theatre itself, turning the stage into an assembly, but never as a thing in itself, never just for the form. For us, the assembly is a process to break down the toxic binary between audience and performers. An assembly by its nature is something to participate in. It is not a show, not something to watch. Instead, we want to give people a taste of cooperative practices. But the most important part is to make a collective decision that leads to a disobedient action outside of the theatre. When an assembly is no longer going beyond itself, when it is just an experience and not a space from which actions can be made, then it loses its raison d'être and becomes hollow. As most of these acts were illegal, we don't have footage of the assemblies itself, but two experiments stand out for us. For Crash, a post-capitalist XII at Arts Admin in London, the audience arrived directly on stage, which was filled with dozens of wheelbarrows with long handles, a lot of plants, and other strange equipment that looked like a kind of survival kit waiting to be activated. The audience were presented with a clownish-like training in consensus decision-making by characters in black leotards, before sitting down in a large circle ready for the assembly to begin. Someone explained the set. The pimped wheelbarrows, which were designed to transform into a mobile camp with tents and gardens that could be set up and taken down quickly. The questions for the assembly was, do we want to take this camp into the nearby financial district and set it up for the evening, even though we have no permission, making it an act of disobedience? Every night, the audience debated and ended up deciding to leave the theatre and disobey. A member of the crew did the facilitation, the crucial craft of listening and synthesizing. Like all the best performances, facilitation requires a deep sensibility, but unlike most performance, it demands a total relinquishing of the ego and an opening up to the collective desires of the participants. Facilitating consensus is a form of channeling. It is the alchemical art of assemblies, distilling the collective sense and differences into a creative solution. A temporary camp was set up, squeezed between the skyscrapers of London's financial centre. This was 2009, 2 years before the Occupy movement. Perhaps the experiment was a kind of poetic prefigurative vision of a movement that would bring collective practices and camps to financial districts across the world 2 years later. In 2012, we brought another audience into an assembly on stage at Camp Nagel in Hamburg for What Is Enough. Where following a legal briefing by lawyers, the audience were asked whether it was ethical to go out to the theatre into the city, armed with ants that sabotage computers and put them into the banks that finance fossil fuels. But that's another story that we don't have time for. Of course, the assembly said yes and went into the city.
We love theatre, but we think that today the best theatre happens outside of its walls and stages. Its beauty is found in the streets and fields, when everyday life becomes entangled with art. We're living in an era marked by a system whose obsession with limitless growth means that until there is some kind of radical system change, it will always place the economy in front of life, sucking the living into its globalized circuits of capital, forever expanding and voraciously devouring more and more worlds. For us, the role of art in the disasters of the capitalist scene is not to show the world to people, but to transform it together. Our most successful and meaningful experiments have always been deeply embedded into self-organized social movements, where we work as organizers and artist-activists co-designing actions. It can involve organising a pirate treasure adventure to find buried boats and launch a regatta to shut down a coal-fired power station during a climate camp. This can mean turning hundreds of abandoned bikes into tools of disobedience during the UN Climate Summit to protect an assembly of indigenous and frontline climate justice organisers from police violence.
It's all about taking their force away, distracting them from the crowd, to keep the crowd safe.
200 people walked out of the conference to come and try and join us. Unfortunately, the police were just too violent and wouldn't let them through.
All arrested, all bike blocked.
We ran into remnants of another swarm after that, and again, all but two arrested.
We have memories of so many dramatic assemblies during these movements, making decisions that had real historical impacts. Imagine 100 people sitting in a circle deciding where to hold the UK's second climate camp, which would involve thousands of people squatting the site of a climate crime and for a week setting up a self-managed camp with hundreds of workshops and mass direct action at its end. Some people wanted to squat the site of Heathrow Airport's proposed third runway. Passions were high. One person is in tears, convinced that the army will be sent in if we touch Heathrow. We take turns to explain our positions or ask questions. We discuss feasibility, political impact, and local endorsements. We will never forget that moment 8 hours into the debate when the facilitator finally asks, "Do we have consensus?" And 100 people waved their hands in silence, signalling their agreement. We have consensus. The next climate camp will take place at Heathrow. The room erupts into loud cheers. We still feel the hairs on the back of our neck tingle as we recall this moment, a moment that made history. The runway is still not built.
We see why theatre makers love the intense drama of assemblies and why they want to bring it into the dark box of the theatre. Yet for us, this is what vampires do, not what artists should be doing at this moment of history. Sucking the form out of political movements to feed a cultural career is what so many so-called political artists are doing despite the crisis of these times. So much creativity is put into building empty mirrors of this dying world rather than constructing ways to resist and build other worlds. We're living in a time where it is easier to imagine the collapse of life as we know it than reinventing the right ways to live together. No artist or activist has ever had to work in such a moment in history, and yet our culture continues to turn its back on life. Business as usual is the order of the day, especially in the museums and theatres of the metropolis. Perhaps the best term is not vampire, though, because vampires don't have a choice. Artists do. Perhaps we could call these practices extractivist art. Extractivism takes nature, stuff, material from somewhere and transforms it into something that gives value somewhere else. That value is always more important than the continuation of life of the communities from which wealth is extracted. Artists' careers are built out of sucking value out of disaster, rebellion, animism, magic, movements, whatever is a fashionable topic at the time, and regurgitate it into an unsituated, detached experience elsewhere. Anywhere, in fact, as long as the codes of the world of art function. But whom do such pieces serve, ultimately? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN climate scientists not known for their revolutionary spirit, wrote in 2018 that if we want to avoid the worst of the catastrophe, we had 12 years left for rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. We must revolutionize so much of our existence, and fast. This must include art. Why make an installation about refugees being stuck at the border when you could co-design tools to cut through fences? Why a performance about the dictatorship of finance when you could be inventing new ways of moneyless exchange? Why make a dance piece about food riots when your skills could craft crowd choreographies to disrupt fascist rallies? Why bring an assembly on stage as a spectacle rather than design joyful ways of making decisions together to be used for social movements to be more resilient?
We are talking to you from a place that taught us many lessons about how to live a shared life. A place that French politicians used to call the territory lost to the Republic, but that we who inhabit it call the zone à défendre, la ZAD, the zone to defend. A place where decisions taken by ragged assemblies of activists, locals and farmers won against the French government and one of the world's largest construction multinationals, Vinci. The ZAD is on the western edge of Europe, on the spine of two watersheds, on the edges of the village of Notre-Dame-des-Landes, near the metropolis of Nantes. Here, living life in common became a weapon against an airport and its world. We don't have time to recount the story of this 40-year-long struggle against those who dreamed of building another temple to hypermobility, another extinction machine, another airport for the city of Nantes. But the resistance began with local peasants in the 70s and spread. During the assemblies of France's first climate camp here in 2009, local inhabitants invited people to come and squat the land. To defend a territory, you need to inhabit it, they said. And that's exactly what happened. Over the years, an autonomous community emerged, with its bakeries, pirate radio stations, tractor repair workshops, brewery, banqueting hall, medicinal herb gardens, a rap studio, dairy, vegetable plots, weekly newspaper, flour mill, library, and even a lighthouse built where they wanted to put the control tower. The ZAD became a concrete experiment in taking back control of everyday life. In 2012, the French state's attempt to evict the zone was fiercely resisted, and neither police nor government officials set foot there again for 6 years. About 80 different collectives were established, and over 350 people shared life together in the way of the bulldozers. The state had gambled on that old story that rulers need to tell themselves, that people without strong governors, weaponized police and prisons will inevitably destroy themselves and fall into chaos. In their imagination, this would be the ZAD's inevitable fate. Those 6 years were no Shangri-La. There were recurrent conflicts and crises between people with very different visions. But everyday life, with its mess and complexities, had to be self-organised, collectively and as horizontally as possible, through affinity groups, working collectives and assemblies, while continuing to organise a movement against the airport. To sense the movement's differences, picture a long assembly co-organising one of the actions to conjure away the airport. Over 100 people fill a barn. Dairy farmers sit next to anti-species vegans, tractor-driving libertarian communists who would provide tons of communal potatoes are opposite primitivists, refusing to have any petrol vehicles or even agriculture near their dwellings. There are feisty retired women for the local towns beside spaced-out barefoot hippie runaways. There are deserting engineers and ex-convicts, drunk punks with dogs and fluffy ecologists, black bloc anarchists next to an ex-mayoress. And these assemblies were some of the most theatrical we'd ever seen, with huge moments of tension, with everyone on the edge of their seats because we were literally organising a movement that meant life or death. Not only for this territory, but for our bodies too. Within the movement against the airport, this ecology of struggle is referred to as its composition. Instead of trying to resolve differences, it requires each component to try and work together to pursue common desires that go beyond what we thought was possible alone. Through the encounter of differences, there is a process of contamination, whereby all change each other. Farmers become squatters, and squatters become farmers. Locals are radicalised, and radicals become locals. This process is far from easy, but when a composition works best, it reflects the self-organising balance of conflicts and mutual aid, competition and partnership of organisms. In an ecosystem's short term, everyone is eating, digesting, and becoming compost for each other. Life is a constant flux of breaking apart and being remade. But in the long term, only behaviours that enable the whole ecosystem to flourish are amplified. Whether it's a prairie or an ocean, a forest or your gut, each interrelated part meets its own needs while creating the conditions that support and transform the whole. In the ecological commons, writes Andreas Weber, the individual can realise itself only if the whole can realise itself. Ecological freedom obeys this form of necessity. The deeper the connections in the system become, the more creative niches it will afford for its individual members. Perhaps we should call the movement process a compost pile rather than a composition. In a compost pile, everything is cross-contaminating. Nothing is pure. Making movements as compost is taking the risk of doing things together, not just sitting around talking about radical ideas.
These wetlands from which we speak continue to become wetlands. Farmland continues becoming food-producing land. Assemblies of inhabitants and users of the land continue to take place. The airport will only ever be a negative shape, a ghost of the extractivist empire. Holding back the monoculture machine, decolonizing a place from capital, opening it up as somewhere that enables forms of life that to connect and unfold. That is what is beautiful. That is the aim of an art of life, an art that lets life live more.
Thank you very much, Isabelle and Jay. Well, there's of course many things in this video to talk about. One thing I think becomes very obvious, how much assemblies are embedded in your everyday life. It is not just something you work on and plan and then it's happening once in a while, but it's rather a constant process, a permanent practice. So this is already something that I guess is a different approach and a different reality from most artistic assemblies. Something else came to my mind when you talked about vampire art. It reminded me of Brecht talking about cannibals drama, Menschenfresser Dramatik, where he commented that putting the stories of the oppressed on stage is basically a repetition of their exploitation. So I wonder, with this clear stance you have towards vampire art, do you still believe that there is political and social value, for example, in symbolic institutions as Milo is proposing them and working on? Or do you think this is just a waste of time?
Well, the answer is always, it depends, of course. I mean, we don't want to make generalizations. I mean, you know, we do have a foot in the theatre spaces and the art spaces. I mean, we haven't really deserted. We do try and dance between the two, and we think that those spaces are, you know, they are public spaces. Mostly they're, you know, funded with public money. They are our spaces. They are our spaces to transform and create. And, you know, I think one can be involved in radical practices within those spaces. I think one thing we realize, though, is often it involves letting go of your cultural capital. And that's quite complicated for artists, and especially for artists who actually, whose living is entirely based on those kind of practices, economically living. But I think, you know, we think that sometimes, you know, that artists are so trapped within that cultural capital that actually they can't, you know, they can push the push a kind of radical agenda or something just so far, and then they'll stop because they know they won't get reinvited to that institutional space. So yeah, those spaces are useful, but I think we often say, you know, be prepared to scupper your boat. In English, there's a term, to scupper the boat. When the boat is about to sink, you put a hole in it so that it sinks safely.
Yeah, and I think that I was very inspired by what Kasia was saying, and I think that this idea of hacking the institutions, is something that I feel very inspired by. Is that because I truly believe that, yeah, these spaces are our spaces. And Kasia asked a fundamental question, is that who comes to these spaces? And I think that there is, when we try to really address these questions and think in terms of hacking and actually reappropriate them genuinely, with this idea of not being extractivist, but really think about the impact it has on the communities that the material is drawn from and on, then they can become spaces that are fruitful and interesting. So yeah, it depends what is being done. I think that for me, when an issue I have really is when the assembly is only taken as the form and is gutted out of everything that it's supposed to do, because an assembly is not a form. An assembly is something where stuff happens, and stuff happens when there is real life in it. It's like a compost pile.
Yeah, I think we will probably, these are at least 2 points, the question of who comes into it and the question of the hackability of an institution. We come back maybe in a moment. Again, I would just maybe, Milo, because due to time reasons, you didn't speak about the General Assembly, which in a way is an example, quite an interesting example. We had a conversation about it also because it most clearly resembles an assembly. Also, it has a certain agenda, and at the same time, it is also an artwork. I guess it's also a stage production. Maybe could you just to bring it into the loop? It doesn't make sense that I explain what was happening there. Just say 2-3 sentences about the General Assembly also, and maybe also then address the question that we also discussed. What is it to be a director of an assembly like this? What does it mean being a director of it in terms of what is proposed?
Yeah, okay. I mean, the General Assembly that was inspired again by the votes in Germany, I think at that moment, like 4 years before. It's 4 years earlier of the Cologne Declaration and the School of Resistance in Cologne. And we were asking ourselves, but who sits in this German parliament? And because it's a very important parliament, because Germany is a very important economic power in Europe and also on other continents, and that's why we were asking, but who should be in the German parliament? So it was a kind of a way to say we have only the 1%. That it's even asked, even inside Germany, you have more than a million of people that has no right to vote. So I mean, that were our question: how could you possibly represent what German economy is doing outside Europe, in the Congo, in Latin America, etc. How can also the nature be represented? So it was a question about, that's true, an intellectual question or a somehow philosophical question about, a political question about representation, and it was trying to build an assembly that could invite everybody who is touched by the decisions of the German parliament. So this was the idea, and we called it World Parliament for that reason. And absolutely, that's a symbolical institution. And I think it was, on the one hand, it was, I would more describe it as an experiment, while, for example, the Revolt of Dignity is really trying to create a sustainable circle. So the General Assembly was more a kind of an experiment to find out, but what, for example, could be discussed there. And the interesting thing that we found out, I'm just remembering now, we found out that when we are talking about world politics, normally it's kind of, we are talking about cultural politics and how to invade other cultural spaces to prescript how they should decide on whatever. While, for example, economy is still extremely nationally decided, and we found out this balance, so to say. On the other hand, yeah, I mean, the General Assembly, I think that's one reason why we went from there to the School of Resistance and to smaller gatherings of how one group, I think we are more in the connecting than with the General Assembly than in the real holistic practice of one group. So it's a very different project to for example the Revolt of Dignity.
Well, General Assembly was really quite an enlightening project when it comes to the possibilities, but also to the limits of artistic assemblies in theater, and to the question of representation in these, to the pitfalls of representations that we are talking about. I remember that at one moment somebody in the audience stood up and said, well, for you it's theater, but for us it's our lives, which is very much in line with what I said about the comment during Artist Organizations International in the very beginning. So this is one thing. The other thing is your role as an artist, as a theater director in this, because you're credited as a theater director. You organized the event, you made the dramaturgy, the setup, and so on. And at the same time, you were disappearing like a theater director in it. And suddenly you were called up on stage and had to intervene at a moment of conflict where the whole project was in a moment where it could have failed, and you were asked on stage and you had to make decisions, were criticized for these decisions. And by this, the whole setup, the whole construction of the assembly as an artistic project became visible. It was really super interesting for all we're talking about at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there was a big dysfunctionality inside. I mean, you were describing this moment, because you saw problems that you will have. I mean, it's kind of how would a newly created impossible assembly, because it was the one problem of this assembly was that there were conflicting ways of thinking things that were so extreme that this assembly all the time was very close to not survive in the next gathering. So, and that was one really big problem. I remember one confrontation between an Armenian citizen or philosopher, a Turkish political figure, and an African philosopher. So, I mean, they were like kind of how we would interpret the next. It was I mean, I'm just now remembering it was a quite crazy experience. That's true.
But can I add to that? Because I remember looking at that in this moment, and Isa said it already, what assemblies are not the form, but some sort of energy. And in this moment where like there was this tumult or conflict, and the audience started to ask questions about democracy and who can speak and who should leave the assembly and what could be said, I really, and I don't want to sound spiritual, but I felt an energy that I think is just possible in liveness. And I mean, that's the great thing when you have a big theater, which you can fill with like 60 activists from all over the world or philosophers, and then create or some sort. We didn't even create this moment. We maybe put the right people in the room, but the moment emerged itself. And then it was there. And then there was really an assembly moment of what is democracy and how can we decide together. And I found that quite also inspiring.
Maybe because to continue just on this, if you were involved in the General Assembly and now you're working on the School of Resistance. Maybe you could also continuing from what you just said. What would you take out of the General Assembly, and for the School of Resistance, and what would you do? What is done differently? What is a different take on it, or how was there a learning process also for you from the School of Resistance, from the General Assembly to the School of Resistance?
I think one of the learning processes was the Revolt of Dignity, and really what Milo already described as getting more in touch with the networks, the people, the activists on ground, really more listening, I think, and really listening in the sense of their needs. And I'm still learning, I think, but for me, it was like the General Assembly was just the start of maybe a process that goes more into the direction what I think Isa and JJ also described of really bringing assemblies or into public space. And if we call it theater or not, but assembling change makers or experts of change or revolutionaries. And for me, it's just like, for me, what I learned the most is, and what I'm really excited now also for Ghent, is really getting to know local initiatives that do great city work, because I think this is, and connecting it to global experts or global activists. And I think this is where I'm really interested in, where the whole right to the city movement of the last 10 years, it started in Barcelona, but it is also present in London and Paris and Berlin. And all these city initiatives do so much amazing work. Like here in Berlin, the expropriation campaign, Die Enteignen, this is radical community work they're doing. And I think, like, how do we assemble this knowledge of the local with the global? So it's faster. We can like spread it faster. That's kind of what I'm interested in.
And perhaps to add one thing to the I think the problematic of representation is the problematic of you called it extractivist or vampiric, and I think it's it's absolutely true. On the other hand, what I learned from sometimes when activists and artists are working together and merging, but also working in some distance, that in these dialectics there can be a multiplication of the effect of what the one side or the other side could do. And that's, for example, I think that this regularization campaign that was initiated by the Revolt of Dignity and helped by the film a lot was already there, but not working. And on the other hand, of course, we didn't initiate it, but coming these two powers together, this, say, propaganda film and this huge distribution machine that we brought with the cinema machine, together with this problematic of being exploited on the field and having to find contracts and having to find a representation to be regularized, it was only in this connection that it worked, and both sides were not complete somehow. And when I'm thinking about it, because of course extractivism is a big problem, I see that there can be a dialectics where these two possible alienations, that the one side can't enter or hack the system and the other side is in the system and doesn't know how to use it, that this coming together is sometimes really beautiful.
I mean, I think that the synergy that we can find between artists and activists is something that we've been exploring and working with for many, many years. And I think that the example of the film for me is exactly the non-extractivist, because it really thought about the impact that it has on the community and how it can change it. And I think that this is where
you're talking about
the new gospel, yeah, is for me is a brilliant example of a piece of art that doesn't take stuff to only feed the artist's career without thinking about the impact, but actually brings the two energies and the two experiences together and tries to really have that kind of synergy to make it more than itself. So I think that this is where it really can become this cross-contamination and become more than itself, which for me is in a way the definition of an assembly, whatever the form is, it's a space that takes the risk, where all the parts in that space take the risk of becoming more than themselves, and accepting to, by becoming more than themselves, maybe lose a little bit of themselves in a very fruitful and productive manner. So, and I think that this is what I find. This is why I think that these institutions still can be hacked and need to be hacked, because I mean, it can produce something that is a very basic principle of redistributing resources. And I think that this is what we need to do, whatever the resources, wherever we are. It's about finding ways to redistribute them and making them more than what they are initially.
But I think that, you know, that there are some frameworks that are so, I feel quite toxic though, still in those spaces. For example, it shocks me to hear you talk about the General Assembly and talk about audience. Because for us, a General Assembly doesn't have an audience. That's the element of assembly, is there is no toxic binary between audience and spectator. And that's why a lot of our practices have always been influenced by carnival or ritual, because for us, that is the, you know, in a way, to make social change, you need to break that audience spectator binary. Doesn't mean, you know, that artists are great at creating events and situations. You don't need that. I think we need to break that. And I think we need to break the hierarchies, you know, the fact that, you know, there's always the director, the piece is always named with a singular person's name. And we know we all work, you know, however much we work, all the practices we do are deeply collective. You know, they're produced by hundreds of different people, and yet so often there's just one name, you know, as the creator, and yet we know that creativity is a collective practice, and normally a practice of synthesis anyway. There's never anything new. We are simply synthesizing our ancestors' ideas.
Maybe to pick up, because it relates to this question, how hackable are institutions actually? And I have the feeling so maybe we stick also, because of the expertise of everybody here, we stick maybe a little bit to the theater scene, because I think in the visual art, the institutions are even more complex because they are more entangled with the market and so on. In comparison to that, theater often seems to be still quite a haven of possibilities. I mean, not to idealize it too much, but at least it's not often not with already boards that would be worried about their collection and so on. So maybe things are a little bit more easy to shift, or that would be the question at least. On the other hand, it's quite the demands also in German-speaking countries, but also in some others, there's quite a discussion around it now, like what kind of leadership should they have? And of course, it usually doesn't say, let's have a general assembly with everybody, but at least it says, can there be a collective running it? I know the group Staub zu Glitzer around Volksbühne wants something that would maybe more go into the direction of a general assembly, but it's, I would say, far from being implemented. So Kasia, you can maybe react to that. But my question is actually, so how much do these institutions have to change, or how changeable are they if they're not really new founded? I mean, Milo, you're the director of Intelligent, and you implement a lot of these things, but I guess you're not working on making a general assembly out of Intelligent, or are you?
Just first to answer to the question of the public in the General Assembly in 2017. Of course, it was an incomplete experiment, and that's why we developed a lot in the questioning how assemblies should work. But actually what it was just 3 days of a parliament from people from all over the world came together to talk and to make decisions on stuff. And the so-called public, you could imagine, like in the real parliament, they could walk in and listen to it, and if they want interfere at moments, it happened all the time, or then go away again. But it was also the idea that these people that came from sometimes really far away and had no voice would not all the time be overthrown by the, I don't know, by the people from Berlin. So there was also a kind of a respect towards this assembly from the so-called public. So that's a bit more the situation that was there. Concerning the Intelligent, I mean, perhaps I can also take it from the side of the public. So you are confronted to immediately with problems that are architectural problems. So you have, I mean, you showed very well. I was for a second thinking, is this the main house of the Intelligent? when you were showing this Italian stage with the balconies, and yeah, so that's how these houses still look. And of course, we are working with formats, hybrid formats outside, formats in our black rooms, and then we exchange. Of course, we play a lot of time. The public is on stage together with what is happening. So you can play around a lot. So that's the one side of, let's say, the situation itself, that you create campaigns, hybrid formats, discussions, days of ongoing assemblies, like this event that would happen now in the Minemeer. So in one room where we can cook and we can discuss, and then we can have at the moment the School of Resistance, and we go on. So these more long-term gatherings of people with many formats, or now we are doing a festival with all our friends from Forêt and from Campo, and so you go from one to the other, and you look this and you look that, and mixing everything, because even the genres are not gathering even in the theater. So you have the opera, and then you have the kind of the city theater, then you have the children's theater, and so on. So to mix this completely, I mean, I could go on for a long time, because I'm I'm quite new in the institutional world, and it's still very interesting to me. But let's say democratize, or I don't know how to call it, ways of deciding that everybody present in an institution, for example, can be heard to make this institution richer, is what we are doing since the beginning, with a lot of tricks that try to overcome, for example, in shifting functions, that when you are an actor, then you can also be a dramaturg, and you can be a director, and you can be at one moment part of a political assembly, so that you would not, in the institution, you are fixed on your position. So that's a bit, yeah, and many more examples. So I stop here. It's
but of course, I mean, it's interesting, because of course you also represent, to come back to something that Jay said before, you represent an institution which is a famous artist, basically, and you also are involved in different institutions, and you're also the director of it. So somehow you also you live and work with this contradiction that you also embrace, I guess, to a certain degree, because it's your modus operandi. Yeah? You also integrate a lot of it. Then it's so how do you feel, or do you ever have the feeling that you actually would give up, or think it would make sense to give up the role you play as a director, but also as a certain person in the real and the symbolic hierarchy? And would that be possible, or something desirable for you?
The symbolic space is a bit more difficult for me to understand and to grasp, but let's take the institutional space. For me, it's the first theater I'm leading, and I'm not born to be an artistic director. But I said, okay, when I go inside an institution, I will take it as an experiment, and I will try to change it as much I can, and make it as much also transparent as possible, that everybody would know what happens and why it happens, etc. And I think the last step, of course, is when I arrived, I said, okay, I will be there for a number of years. I said 5 years. I think now with Corona, I will stay a little bit longer. But I think it's like with the symbolical institution, you always have to work that you don't feel anymore. I mean, that you can, or that you kind of, this change you want to introduce is not necessary anymore. When I arrived at the Intelligent, it was a beautiful house, but with a fully white ensemble with star actors, and the kind of a cut, let's say, relation to the society, to the city, to the politics. And I said, okay, I want to open all those wide open, that society can come in again in the city theater, because it's a theater of the city. So that's what I try to do, and where I want to go further. But in the end, it's very clear that I have to disappear in, let's say, not so many years, and then that was it for the end again. And for me, I mean, it's yeah, on the other hand, I also feel solidarity, and it's difficult to disappear. For example, when we take the new gospel, I mean, every day I'm having 1, 2, 3 phone calls with our activist friends from South Italy, and then we bring the tomatoes there, and we bring the tomatoes there. We try to push it here. Then we do another show of the film in a church, in many churches here and there and here and there. So when you are once involved, you continue. So it's also very difficult, I think, to go away. And I think that, I mean, somehow it's the most radical practice, again, what you are doing in the SAT, to just say, okay, that's the center, that's the place, and everything that happens in this in this world, and that's another radicality. So I mean, yeah, being director still is a bit, or artist is still a bit vagabondage, and it's I don't know how to really bring it together.
But maybe to continue, Kasia, with your experience with the art institutions and theaters, and maybe also in working in different places. So as I said, you're also part of a group which we talked about in the series already, that has quite radical demands for Volksbühne, but is not really involved in it. So it's a bit demands from the outside, which are probably the most radical. On the other hand, you're also living with compromises, I guess, every time you work in an institution. So what compromises are you willing to accept, and how far do you really imagine that institutions could change in the direction that we were talking about?
So I just want to share the crazy discussions over the last years I had with my dear colleague and friend and mentor Eva Maria Berci, and my comrade Sarah Waterfeld, who have very differing views on the whole idea of funding and money, because in the end, that's it when we're speaking about distribution and redistribution. And also city theaters in Germany have immense money. Like the Volksbühne has immense money that can be used. And I mean, the contradiction probably is what kind of money you use for what. And I think that's also a little bit the hacking. So in the end, I mean, we have to question why, I mean, already also German universities, but also German theaters are funded by economics, like economic partners. So we have, of course, money that is also public money is also, we know what money is. It's an energy, but it is also corrupted. And so I think these are the contradictions living in this world. So having radical demands for a collective opening and also leading of a city theater, and also then using the money that the state or city gives to you, but then also using funds and money, of course, of funders. And I think this is a big contradiction where I'm still thinking, and we're all thinking. But other than that, I would say, just speaking about the radical opening, or as you said, the critical kind of mass that questions the city theater as an institution and wants to create an institution. I mean, that's the only thing that Staub zu Glitzer 2017 tried to do with the transmedia performance B6112. So it was just, okay, the city reclaimed it and said, this is our space. We can use it and we can do whatever we want with it, and we can organize it. And we can organize ourselves, because as Isa and Jay said in their also film, I mean, it's what we learned as collectives and as a humanity. If we want, we can really organize ourselves. And I think I'm just happy that the anarchist I'm entering these institutions, and people are like, I'm just also very happy to enter these spaces, because I think, we see it with activists from all over the world, in Russia, in Belarus, in Colombia, people and artists and activists who have radical views of how to change the world. Or also Isa and Jay talking about what is happening on the ZAT, and also in other collective campaigns. It's also dangerous. And I'm happy that I'm right now as privileged as I am of doing the work I do, and trying to also bring two-stage people or into the center of the work we do that are not so privileged. Like, I don't know, we have this very great protagonist who will also come in March to Ghent, Parwana Amiri. She's a poet, an activist from Lesbos. She's a young refugee woman from Afghanistan who's a writer. And I don't know, I just, through the networks we have, we are connected with her right now that well, that we want to publish her poems. We want to invite her, and just giving us a stage to an underprivileged artist maybe. And then we can question again who's curating what and who's deciding what, and we all want to decide together, but it's probably the experiment we're still living in. I hope I was not too flowery. Thank you.
So Jake. Yeah, but just one thing about, hacking an institution. I mean, we know very well that institutions have feedback. A powerful institution, any powerful group, any powerful collective, any powerful assembly will have very powerful positive feedback loops. You go in and you become influenced by that group. You become, because you want to stay part of it. I mean, it's an inevitable thing. And we can see how, the last post-60s attempt by radical movements to become political parties, then enter parliament, and the German Greens being the classic European example of this process, how, you start off thinking you're going to hack the system and you end up actually being part of it. And so I think, that's, for us, we've always said, stay on the edges. If you're neither we try really to stay on the edge. We're in the radical social movements, and we have one foot in the radical social movements, and we have one foot in the institutions. But we really value that edge, that neither falling into one or the other, but keeping on that edge, which in ecological terms, the edges are always the most fertile. They're where there's the most combination of relationships between different species. And I think the danger of hacking is that you become the darkness that you want to get rid of.
All right, slowly we also probably have to come to an end, and maybe to just bring up, we will not solve this, but to bring up two intertwined aspects of assemblies that we were talking about tonight already a couple of times, but also in the whole series of the Art of Assembly. One is the question of who is actually part of these assemblies. Kasia, you were in the beginning mentioning who's actually going to a theater. So, but I think it also relates to a degree to activist assemblies. Who's part of these assemblies? Who's not part of it due to social reasons, to other mechanisms of inclusion, thresholds, etc. So who should be part but isn't, and how do we deal with that? And on the other hand, whom don't we want to be part of these assemblies? Whom do we not accept? Where are the limits of what we want to represent in these assemblies? And this question, which already is wide, I know, is intertwined, I guess, with another thing that we already touched upon, is what is the aim of these assemblies? What is the modus operandi of these assemblies? Do we aim for consensus, as it is happening in activist assemblies usually, as you were mentioning, Isabelle and Jay? Or do we aim for showing the conflict, at offering an arena for agonistic struggles, as we called it often in the series, drawing on Chantal Mouffe? So it's especially theater, a place where conflicts can be represented and acted out that maybe in society already are very difficult to act out. So I know that's a wide field and a large question. It's more bringing maybe these aspects into these conversations. So, and maybe you just pick whatever you find interesting to respond to. Milo, for example. So, do you believe in consensus?
Yes and no. I think it was also in your film, or it was something you said, that don't imagine it as that everybody would all the time agree. No, all the time there is discussion. I mean, consensus actually is very antagonistic, in my humble opinion. and that's how I for example learned it in the New Gospel. You can see it. But for me was in the New Testament, the very interesting thing is that the group around Jesus, so let's see, this activist group, is not imploding because of the pressure of the empire, is imploding because of the disagreement of the people inside the group. So, and that's very important to understand, that there is not consensus and the happy group of the activists and they would all be agreeing all the time. And on the other hand, you have a kind of a, let's say, more classical democratic idea that you have majority and minority and different parties fighting each other and so on. I think you have, even in the smallest group, you have these different parties all the time. But the interesting thing for me in this project is really the moment of, in a common project, integrating these different powers. I think you called it compost, or I don't know, that you would kind of live together and have this friction all the time. And somehow something else starts existing, which is much more intelligent than all these little disagreements, or you even understand that these disagreements were necessary. I mean, the whole film, The New Gospel, is about the disagreement of classical trade unionists, Gianni Fabris, and a modern way of organizing of these migrant farm workers like Ivan. And then you have and in the end they somehow come together. And of course, this is a very old leftist utopic idea that you would overcome antagonism but not deny antagonism. And that's what makes me think your beautiful question, Florian.
I mean, I certainly agree that consensus is essentially a space of disagreement and conflict. And I think that we should not be scared of conflict. We need to learn how to deal with it in a way that is not this this terrible state of a situation where there necessarily is a loser and a winner. And I think that this is so much how we are educated into thinking. And I think that conflict is a very, very fruitful and productive state of affair if we learn how to make it something that is, again, I repeat myself, but when we learn to make it more than what it was in the beginning, then it can become something that is very, very synergetic. And it's just a matter of, and it's not about being, super utopian. It's about learning to actually listen, genuinely listen to the other, and believe in collective intelligence. And I think that this is what all the spaces can be, the any kind of space can be the space for that kind of practice, because it is a practice, and it is a practice that is slow, and that can be at times painful, and at times the most exhilarating experience that one can have. But it's a practice that is at the roots, in my view, at the roots of the changes of the worlds that we want to see. So we need to relearn to do things together. I mean, it sounds really basic, but I think that this is what really we've been spoiled of that capacity, and we need to relearn it. And of course, you need to have some common ground, but I think that there are spaces that have shown, like Occupy, for instance, was a space that showed that people have more common ground that they are being given credit for, and that when given the opportunity, or when the opportunity is grabbed, then they actually show that they have more common ground, and that common ground is actually being denied. And it's being broken, and everything is done so that common ground is not made, is not turned into solidarity. It's like, actually, I really think that very often solidarity is broken by, authorities much more than by people themselves. So it's a practice, and it's a practice that can really be unfolded in absolutely every setting, including theaters. And I think that there are theaters, as I know that Vorot, for instance, have really tried to explore ways of even managing a theater in very collective ways. And it's complex, and and it's a matter of, it's trial and errors all the time, but life is trial and error.
But whenever we teach consensus, we say it's a tool. We can run many things on consensus, but there is the pirate, what we call the pirate technique, that actually there's one thing you can't run with consensus, and that's war and conflict and fighting. And that's part of a revolutionary process. And the pirate ships often were run as direct democratic assemblies. And then when they actually went and went to get another ship, then the captain would take charge for the moment of conflict. And we've had many experiences of where we thought we could run conflict through consensus. Well, and I'm talking actually struggling with authorities or actions and so on. But actually, consensus is just a tool for most things in life except war. So in war we can have, the Zapatistas are the same. The community, run the communities, except in conflict when, it used to be Subcomandante Marcos, and now it's Moses who run the army.
I would just like to add two things to what maybe Isa said. So the so-called evolution of safer spaces into braver spaces. So because I think everybody's just really tired. And we're the problem with this whole process of learning to talk again with each other and learn compromise, it takes time, and we all don't have the time right now for the healing. There's colonial trauma, there's patriarchal trauma, and there's no time to heal, but we need the time to relearn it again, how to interact and really true solidarity. And that's what I always feel okay, but I feel there's movement right now. Things are changing, which makes me happy. And the other second thing is maybe to saying what Jay said, to some people, you don't speak with some people. I'm sorry. If someone is a fascist, I say, who wants to kill people because of the way they look or they are or they feel or they think, I radically want to be against this person, and that's my enemy. And I don't know, this is maybe something where we're all still slumbering around. What's the next stage of it all?
Thank you, Kasia. Perfect last words, I would say. And also I'm thankful, of course, for the link you already made to our next edition, which will have the title Safe versus Brave, Art Spaces Between Sanctuary and Confrontation. And my guests will be Edith Caldo and Julian Warner. So I hope you will join again to listen to that. And if you want to stay informed, please subscribe to our newsletter at www.art-of-assembly.net. Thanks so much to you all. Thanks to you, Milo, Kasia, Isabelle, and Jay for your contributions and this very interesting and for me quite enlightening conversation. And hope to see you all again. All best.
Brut, New Art on Stage.